Well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started with our first session of My Money and Me. I see there are still folks joining, and I appreciate that. You're putting in your first name, last name, email address, city and state. And of course, if you want the AFCPE continuing education units, just put that in there also. Assuming everyone can hear me, if someone would be willing to type into the chat pod that they can indeed hear me, that would be helpful. My name is Wanda Roberts, and I'll basically be the hostess and the person trying my best to drive this Adobe Connect bus. I apologize, Wanda, that there's some sort of static. Maybe our friends at Iowa State can help with that, or maybe it's something you can check on your end. So currently, I'm the co-chair of the Financial Security for All Community of Practice through E-Extension, and I'm also part of Michigan State University Extension's Financial and Homeownership Education team. So this is the first in a four-part series, and we're going to be bringing you some useful information that hopefully can help us all be more responsible and productive with our relationship with money, and also, of course, be helpful to those with which we work. And we'll be learning some easy-to-follow methods to identify and work through any money-related issues. We'll be touching on also SMART goals and how to develop a personal spending plan through this series. And so in taking this whole four-part series, you will have the skills to better manage your money and also, again, help others that you work with. So in part one, Know the Flow, we're going to be focusing on household assets, liabilities, and net worth statements, and a cash flow statement. And so we'll also look beyond just sort of the numbers and talk about how things are related, both between assets, liabilities, income, and expenses, and really how all of these may affect our perceived or our actual net worth. And then we'll also be talking about investment concepts such as consumption, saving, and investing, and looking at basic financial asset classes, stocks, bonds, and cash, and how their risk and return attributes affect or contribute to our potential income and net worth. So some housekeeping items. Said most of you have already got it, putting in your name, first name, last name, email, city, and state. And if you need continuing education units, we'll do our best to monitor the chat pod with questions and answer those either during the presentation when appropriate or also after the session. Wonderful. Well, I apologize, folks, for that little glitch. I mean, I can't believe we even have challenges with the phone line sometimes. So not sure where exactly we lost it, but if folks would take a couple minutes to click on that pre-survey link, it's in the third pod there on the screen, and we'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes to complete that survey. And when you're finished, when you come back into the Adobe Connect space, if you would just raise your hand so we know that you're finished, then we'll get started. And yes, we'll start the PowerPoint as soon as you guys come back from taking your pre-survey. it looks like we have about 32 participants on the webinar. And so if folks are completing the pre-SurveyMonkey assessment, when they're finished, if they would come back and raise their hand. Once we get a majority of folks, we'll get started with the webinar. Well, I assume there are still folks that are taking the pre-survey from the SurveyMonkey link. So I'm going to do the introduction of Mark Robinson, our speaker, and we'll get rolling. So Mark Robinson has over 27 years of professional experience in the financial services industry, and is a Certified Investment Management Analyst and an accredited investment fiduciary analyst. Mark has provided investment-related advice and services to individuals, private trusts, even small nonprofits. And he's applied his industry knowledge to several investor education endeavors. The most recent one was this past April. Michigan had a really large Money Smart Week effort, and that was led by Mark in a program called Be a Money Smarty. He also works with our state of Michigan's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, heading up our investor education in your community program. And Mark, along with MSU Extension and myself, helped develop this My Money and Me series. And in addition, Mark has also been sought out for his guidance and sharing his expertise with other states as they continue to develop their investor education curriculum. So I'm going to remove a couple of the pods here and hand this over to Mark.
Thank you so much for attending. I see we have attendance from Anchorage to California to Florida, all the way up to New Hampshire and Delaware, and welcome all today on what here in Michigan is a very, very hot, steamy day, and we hope to have a nice, hot, steamy presentation for you on something that can be a little bit dry, which is money, but we hope to move through this in a way to where you're able to learn a few things or reinforce a few things, and over the course of the series, say that you have a much better relationship and understanding of the workings of your money and the uses of monies to further benefit you over the long term, or your clients, for those of you who are taking this as continuing ed. The name of this program again is Be a Money Smarty, My Money and Me. And this is offered through, again, our securities division here in the state. All of you have them, your securities regulators for your state, that typically regulate the brokers, the stockbrokers, the registered investment advisors, financial professionals, banks, and they are also involved in the review of product offerings that are available for sale through financial services providers, and most of them provide investor education. Here's what we're going to learn today in Know the Flow about your assets, your liabilities, and your net worth statement. For those of you who might be accountants or CPAs, Some of these are going to murder you because they do not follow traditional standards. They are more put together for households so that they are more intuitive. And this is to get us to where we are at least working through the process of understanding what an asset is, our liabilities, net worth statements in a way that are practicable on a household level. So we'll learn about a cash flow statement, savings and investing. And then we're going to talk about the three basic asset classes of stocks, bonds, and cash and their particular risk and return attributes. In part 2 and in part 3, we'll take the stocks, bonds, and cash and we'll start to animate them into portfolios that are matched up to goals, which we'll learn about in part 2 of this program. Next slide, please. All right, just some introductions here with some terms. An asset is what you own. A liability is what you owe. Income is money you receive from any source. An expense is money that you spend. And your net worth is simply what you own minus what you owe. More on this. What you own is called an asset. Now, there's 4 types of assets. One that can provide income or are likely to appreciate, likely to depreciate. We have income-producing assets, and assets can take another form, and that is in the form of cold, hard cash. So what we have, I believe, coming up here is a poll, Wanda. So here's the poll. What is an example of an asset that provides income and is likely to appreciate? So use your imagination, or for those of you in the financial services industry, please give us some examples of what we might not think are assets that provide income or are likely to appreciate. Let's just give just a few seconds for this. I'm seeing one. Here's a rental home. Excellent answer. Rental property would fall in real estate, may or may not be, and that's what the variability is with some of these assets, is that they can be appreciating and certainly help your balance sheet until suddenly they're depreciating for us, which we certainly saw with the stock market and the real estate market back in 2007, 8, and 9. 401k, composed of stocks and bonds and real estate and perhaps even natural resources mutual funds, certainly has the potential to appreciate for you. Mutual funds, real estate, a gas well could be a producer of income and would indeed be an asset, and that could be very specific for those of you that are in the Midwest or in the West. Gas wells or the like, your house, farmland, art. Yes, all of these are good examples of assets that have the potential, not necessarily do they, but have the potential to generate income and to appreciate. And it's interesting to finally see, after several years, items like mutual funds and 401k showing back up as something that is likely to appreciate. And let's go to number 2 here. And these are some great answers. Thank you. It adds a lot of richness to the presentation. All right, so what is an example of an asset that is likely to depreciate in value? Yes, excellent. Cars, autos, however defined. Yes, your home can indeed. And what we learned back in the 2000s was this whole idea that your house does nothing but appreciate. Well, we found out that that is not necessarily the case, and that real estate, homes, go through cycles also, and it's a matter of when you buy that home, whether it is something that will appreciate for you over and above the rate of inflation or could actually depreciate for you. So it's good to see that the house is not a gimme as necessarily appreciating for you, which is what we found early in 2000s, as along with the stock market also. There was just a presumption that these things went up in value, and indeed they don't. So we've worked through what an asset is. We've talked about the different types of assets. So a liability is what you owe, and that could show up as a mortgage, a car loan, student loan, and credit card debt. So assets, what you own, liabilities, what you owe. And let's take a look at a poll on this. So what are the basic four things that you can do with money when we start getting into spending and liabilities? What are 4 things, basic things that you can do with your money? Ah, yes. Thank you. Yes, of course. Spend it. Enjoy. Enjoy it. That is good old American consumerism. Enjoy it and spend it. And then someone else put in here, put it in the bank, which would be saving. The banking of, or the avoidance of risk by saving the money and putting it into a bank. So yes, you can save it, you can spend it, you can invest it, or you can do nothing with it, which is just a form of, in effect, holding it or saving it. You can purchase items with it. So you have literally covered the gamut here. What we can do with our money are basically 4 things. We can spend it. We can use it to pay down our liabilities, as we define that as anything that you owe. We can save it. And then we can do something interesting, which is actually to invest our money. First, we need to look at where our money is and how these assets and liabilities show up. On the left side, the green side, are your assets. On the right side, in the pinky red, are your liabilities. And why we go through this exercise is to arrive at the bottom, which is your net worth, which is really the end game for all of us, is increasing our net worth. In other words, having more assets than we do liabilities. Now, this is where this gets interesting, because those assets that appreciate for us, there's different types that appreciate for us. Yes, you might think that all of your Elvis memorabilia or your paintings on black velvet, they may be very special to you, but do they truly have appreciation potential? And what happens is typically on the left side, the liabilities, there's not a lot of fluctuation to those unless you pay them off. They either have an interest rate assigned to them that has them grow if you are not paying on them, or they're relatively fixed, and how they go away is by you making payments on them. Where the fluctuation typically is that affects that net worth is what's going on the asset side. And so we need to look at what are those that produce income or the potential for appreciation. Those would be your money market accounts, cash on hand certainly produce income. The personal use assets, this is where we get interesting and where they may either appreciate or depreciate based on where we are in market cycles. What we would like to see is in the investment assets, contributions, and the growing of assets either in mutual funds, brokerage accounts, IRAs, or some other type of employer-based retirement program is where we can start to grow the assets, understanding that there is indeed a lot of fluctuation there. So here's where this would show up. Income or appreciation could show up in cash accounts, could show up in the investment assets. Likely to depreciate could show up in personal use assets, as well as they could also have income or appreciate. Income consuming would fall into personal use assets again. And the cold hard cash typically finds its way into our checking accounts, money market accounts, or just cash on hand. All right, so we've talked about assets, liabilities, and net worth from a very basic level. Let's move over into the flow of those assets, or that cash is cold hard cash, into income. Income, simply stated, is money received. So whether it is hourly wages, tips and commissions, interest and dividends off of investments, pensions, Social Security, or other fixed benefits that you're receiving, all of those come in as money received. If you work on a corner in a college town with your violin or clarinet, with the case open and people throw quarters into it, that is money received and is construed as income. So we have 2 types of income. Remember, we had 4 types of assets. Well, we have 2 types of income, and this is very important from a planning standpoint when you look at your cash flow. Is this cash flow, this income, is it dependable, long-term, or is it variable or unreliable or less reliable? So let's take a quick little poll here on what types would fall, which are examples of dependable long-term income. So take your time and vote through these, and we'll come back at this and hopefully have some interesting answers. Where we're seeing the trend is that certainly salary is showing up as an example of dependable long-term income. Social Security, politics aside and all of the talk, has been indeed dependable income. I see someone has answered day trading, but we certainly have those that have some skill at that, but perhaps for most of us, that is perhaps something that we should avoid. But I think you have this right. We can look at tips and you can say, well, you know what, I work at a great restaurant and I've got a lot of customers, but I'm also a 53-year-old divorced mother, and I can't do this forever. And sometimes I can't make it to work for one reason or another. So tips is probably not what we would construe as good, reliable, long-term income. So you've got it here with the salary and Social Security are both good examples of dependable long-term income. So the best which represent dependable would be Social Security and the salary. Let's look at expenses. I don't think we need many examples on how to spend money. A lot of you just described that as going out and having fun with the money, but it does also mean looking at our fixed expenses, those things that we need that come up on a recurring basis to just run our household. And here's how these show up. First type is fixed, a fixed expense. Now there is an accounting term for that, and then there's just one that we just kind of intuit, we as consumers. And those are those expenses that are on a recurring basis, and typically the amount is fixed. In other words, it's the same amount. Typically they are those things that we pay for to run our household. So some examples of that would be your house payment or rent payment, any taxes associated with those. We often look at our utilities, even though the price or the amount that you're paying can fluctuate on those. We look at those as fixed because it's something we need and we pay it on a recurring basis, and we just plain need to have them. So utilities typically fall into that. So would loans and lease payments on our cars, etc. And credit cards. Typically, a credit card, if you're paying off the balance, we call that fixed because it's coming due every 30 days, and you're either making a minimum payment on it or you're making the full payment on it. So we put it under fixed as those things you just have to pay. Now, it could fall into the variable or recurring, because you might say, you know what, I run up my credit card and whatever the balance is, I pay it off. So it's variable, but it's still recurring. And we can look at our utilities. Though we construe them as fixed, many of them are variable recurring. Sometimes your water bill is higher. Sometimes your cell phone bill is higher. Things along that line that can have some fluctuation in the value of them. The third one is discretionary. These are things to where we make a conscious decision, and often there's a conflict between what we want and what we need, and that fights itself out on where those dollars are spent on a discretionary basis. Groceries, depending on the types of groceries you buy and where you buy them and what groceries are composed of when you take them home and start emptying them, could be variable recurring for staples, but it could also have an element of discretionary involved in there. So can personal care. So can entertainment. Most in the entertainment fall under the discretionary, those dollars that we spend as either a treat or some way of taking care of ourselves or rewarding ourselves show up in the discretionary. We have another category that's called fixed discretionary. And those are those discretionary items that we're just fixed on having. It is not uncommon in doing financial planning where we are looking at how we can optimize those 100 pennies in a dollar and where we push those off on what people think is fixed and what is a fixed discretionary. And I will have people look through a list very similar to this, and in the third boxed area, look right past the club. Because why? it's a fixed discretionary. Well, they can't live without with their club. They can't live without that, or other things. And this is where this relationship that we have with money manifests itself and plays out on our cash flow statement as to what we really want and what perhaps we need. And if we are trying to save money for particular goals, which will be described in Part 2 and Part 3 of this series, there's only 100 pennies in the dollar. So we either need to make more or we need to allocate those 100 pennies in the dollar differently. So just going back to looking at fixed discretionary and looking at some of our fixed expenses, do I need to have that phone package, the cellular phone package that I have that has all of the tricked out features to it? Do I have to have that? My water bill on my 9,000-gallon jacuzzi, do I have to keep that at 102 degrees 12 months out of the year? So here's where, even on these more noble things, we'll have to pay my utility bill, where this fixed discretionary comes in. Well, I have to make my boat payment or my jet ski payment. Is that really a fixed expense that you absolutely necessarily have to have, or that at some point, was it a discretionary spend that suddenly found its way to a fixed discretionary? The purpose of this part is just to have you regard the relationship with your money a bit differently and to look at assets a bit differently and liabilities a bit differently. All right, next one, please, Wanda. All right, I think we have a little quiz here, a poll coming up. All right, what creates a liability at the point of a sale? And this might be a little bit of a trick one here. We've got trending 100% at credit card. We've got 15. And I think that pretty much sums it up. We have nobody that has put cash, and that's very much the correct answer. And the reason we bring that up, so the correct answer would be, for example, a credit card purchase of high-def television with a credit card is a liability. And if you pay for it with cash, well, there isn't a liability. So a liability is when we do not pay for it, and it might come 30 days later. So we're, in effect, using money that we have to pay for later, creates that liability because we're not paying for it directly. Now, why did I bring that up? Here's why. Often when you swipe the credit card, it distances you from the consequence of actually spending the money, because paying for it is deferred. And so that gets in the way often of us making more reasoned decisions on, do I really need this at this price? Because it separates us from going through that process when you have to lay out the $20 bills or the $100 bills as opposed to just swiping it. Okay, we've talked about assets, liabilities, net worth statements, cash flow statements. Let's move over now to saving and investing and asset classes. Here's a definition of save: to avoid the spending, consumption, or waste of, and I plugged in money; to rescue from danger or possible harm, injury, or loss. And here's a third definition: to keep, as for reuse. Now, when I look at this, I see a deliberate action with a potential consequence. Save, to avoid the spending, or to rescue from possible loss, overspending. So all of these tie into your decision to not spend and to convert that into something else in the collective, which would be savings. Now, we can also take savings and look at the third definition, to keep as for reuse, and that would mean to take collective savings and put them into something that is called investing. So investing is the deliberate assumption of risk. And there are three basic asset classes: stocks, bonds, and cash. Now, there are what are called sub-asset classes that would include real estate and hard assets or natural resources. And if indeed you invest that way, or in your practice you include those as asset classes, then they would be in addition to these three broad, generally recognized asset classes. What's an asset class? A grouping of securities that have similar characteristics, react similarly in the marketplace, and are subject to the same regulations. And a security is just a publicly traded financial instrument. Every stock that trades on an index, individual bonds, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds are all securities. So just a publicly traded financial instrument. Cash we construe as something that is called ready money. In other words, you can get your hands on it. Bonds are debt securities that are issued by publicly traded companies, municipalities, state and federal governments. And when you own bonds, you are a creditor. You lend money to these entities and they pay you a fixed rate of return for a fixed time period, in most instances, for the use of that money. And with stocks, you're an owner. So you own and have equity in a publicly traded company, and indeed, if you are in stocks or individual companies whose earnings or revenues are growing at a rapid pace relative to their peers or the economy, then maybe that'll be recognized in the marketplace and the stock value will go up. Ways that you can invest in these broad asset classes are through something we call mutual funds, which invest in a basket of securities. They all have a stated investment objective to them. Mutual funds are priced at the market close. So unlike buying the individual stocks or the individual bonds that are in that mutual fund, you can buy those while the market is open. Mutual funds are priced at the end of the day. Now, here's where this is important. Mutual funds are longer-term investments. And the studies have shown whether you buy it at the high of the day or the low of the day, it really doesn't make any difference. But what I want you to avoid is this. I remember a circumstance 3 years ago, where the market was down 300 points in the middle of the day. If you thought, gee whiz, that's a cheap market, I'm going to go in and buy my favorite mutual fund and add to that in my 401k, and you put your trade in, suddenly the market turned around and went back to even and closed up 300. So though I was putting in my trade for that mutual fund when the market was down 300, I actually bought very expensive shares that day because the market closed up 300. So unlike individual securities that you can buy intraday, mutual funds are at the close, and they are sold by prospectus. And as consumers, and those that are in the financial services industry will tell you that prospectus has a lot of information in it, and they've become much easier to read. You'll know who you're giving the money to, what their credentials are, what they are going to do with the money, and how much it cost you. And it also shows how they've done in the past with other people's dollars. Another very popular pooled investment, but doesn't qualify as a mutual fund, but is kind of composed the same way as mutual funds are, baskets of securities, are ETFs, exchange-traded funds. Typically, they're passive, meaning they are index-based, and we can buy all sorts of broad market indexes. For example, the S&P 500, which is a broad market index. You can buy foreign indexes, bond indexes, and so exchange-traded funds are a very cost-effective way to purchase this. Now, we are finding that people want access and dominion over their money on an ongoing basis. And where these are popular is that they trade like stocks. So in the example I gave you, when we were buying a mutual fund and the markets were down 300 and they actually closed up 300 on the day, my mutual fund would have been a very expensive buy for me. Had I bought it the same, let's say, index fund through an exchange-traded fund, I could have gone in when the market was down 300 and bought those very inexpensive shares, whereas through the mutual fund, they would have been much more expensive. So they are a very good complement with an E to open-end mutual funds getting involved with exchange-traded funds. Let's go to a poll here. Which represent a broad asset class? Now, this might be a little tricky, but it'll help us drive home what really an asset class is, as opposed to what you've learned a security is. Very good. A moment to learn here. Almost 80% of you said that a mid-cap stock mutual fund is a broad asset class. Let's look at this. The answers are stocks and bonds. A mid-cap stock mutual fund, though it is composed of stocks, which are an asset class, a mid-cap stock mutual fund is a security, as is a corporate bond mutual fund. So an actual asset class, stocks, bonds, and cash. And then within securities, they're composed of stocks or bonds asset classes. So the correct answer in this are stocks and bonds, and it's important to know the difference between what an asset class is and a tradable security composed of stocks and bonds, and some funds composed of both stocks and bonds. All right, let's move from asset classes over to risk and return attributes for stocks, bonds, and cash. Risk. How do we define risk? This could be quantified, but it's also kind of a feely thing. So there's qualifiable as well as quantifiable aspects to risk. Uncertainty of outcome, significant ups and downs, potential to realize a loss, that is, lose money, returns, gain or loss realized in a stock or bond, an increase or decrease in the value of a portfolio, or the average annual rate of return. Now, this is interesting. Graham and Dodd define risk as the potential to lose money, realizing a loss. But it's interesting how much of us, or how many of us, define risk as more of a, a visceral thing. Ups and downs, uncertainty, the riskiness of an investment. Not so much losing money, but just having it go up and down, which doesn't say anything about risk at all. It's talking about volatility. We'll learn more about that in part 4 of My Money and Me. And on returns, gains realized or lost, average annual rates of return. So in this context, we have the returns on your investment or your 401k. And then again, average annual rates of return, for example, for a broad market were measured over an 80-year period or so. Here's the risk-return attributes of cash. Low-risk asset with, as we've been experiencing over the last several years, very low returns. And cash equivalents, meaning that are just like having cash in hand. Examples would include 13-week Treasury bills, CDs, money market funds. These are all construed within, for example, an employer retirement plan or a brokerage account would be construed as cash equivalents. Stable value funds, for those of you that have employer-sponsored plans that have stable value, would also be construed as cash. Bottom line, very low risk, and consequently, because you're not taking a lot of market risk, very low returns. You know what? We've got something here that needs to be brought up. And I believe we might have a poll question on this, but maybe this will help answer the poll question. Low-risk investments have high risk of inflation loss. Absolutely correct. So you need to choose what you want to be afraid of. A little bit of up and down in a particular account or a particular investment that is just endemic with things that are in growthier investments like real estate or stocks. Do you want to be afraid of short-term ups and downs, or do you want to be afraid of losing your purchasing power when measured over a multiple-year period? So you can have a very low-risk investment and say, I'm not losing anything. But indeed you are. And this is an issue with those of us in the financial services profession. How do I define preservation of principal or keeping my money safe? Is it defined as not losing a dollar value? Or is it defined as keeping the purchasing power of that the same or at the rate of inflation, so that I'm keeping the dollar whole with a W? So it's a very good point brought up. But just from a volatility standpoint, unfortunately, which is how we look at risk for the most part, and return, cash has the lowest return and the lowest risk. Bonds are next. Higher risk than cash, and typically a higher return than cash when measured over multiple decade periods. Now, you have two risks with bonds. We have interest rate risk, and we have credit risk. And I think we're going to a poll here. Which statement is true? Not as quick with the answers. You're thinking about it. Well, this is interesting because it's trending 90%. That as interest rates rise, the price of existing bonds decline in value. And that blows away what we find from a financial literacy standpoint. Most people, so that would mean the majority, don't know that quirky relationship between interest rates and bonds. And this isn't merely academic, because what we have seen since the 1980s has been the biggest bull market in bonds since back in the Revolutionary War, when we were printing treasury bills to pay for the war. Rates have done nothing for the most part but go straight down from the early 80s, where treasuries were at 16%, down to 2%. And that has done nothing but drive up the value of bonds and bond funds. So most of us that have bonds or have had bonds in our 401ks, or we own them individually, we have seen them do nothing but appreciate for us until this year. And as interest rates start to rise, your traditional experience with bonds could radically change. And if rates were to really spike up, or if inflation were, as we call it, really start to pop up, you could see bond prices drop dramatically, which we haven't experienced. So it's important to know the relationship between interest rates and the price of bonds. So the correct answer is, as interest rates rise, the price of existing bonds decline in value, and the corollary, as interest rates decline, which is what we've experienced until this year, the price of existing bonds decline in value. And I believe we have a graphic on that. Here it is. The triangle is the fulcrum, and let's pretend that the going rate on new $1,000 bonds is 6%. That's what we would call the current yield, which is how bonds and bond mutual funds are priced, based on the current yield. So let's say right now you're driving down the street and every bank has a 10-year CD at 6%, or all new good quality corporate bonds for 10 years are a 6% coupon. So all of them being minted that day are $1,000 with a 6% coupon. Now, if nothing changes and rates stay bang on at 6% for that 10-year period, that price isn't going to change, because the interest rate has not moved up or down, which, as we've learned, affects the price of the bond. So let's say the next day interest rates go to 7%. So new bonds and new CDs are coming out with a 7% coupon. So in other words, for every $1,000 that you buy, they're going to pay you $70 as opposed to $60. So what does that do to your bond that's paying 6% or $60 per thousand? Well, it goes down in value because the current yield is higher. So you see the market work here. Gee, 6% isn't as much value as I can get right now as 7%. But if I want to sell my bond, or my CD, if it's a marketable CD, that's 6%, the market will say, all right, you can sell it, but to have it priced what the current market is, 7%, we have to discount it. So that $60 payment for your skin in the game, $857 as opposed to $1,000, equals the 7%. So if you're a buyer of a bond with a 6% coupon in a 7% environment, you can buy it at a discount. If you're a seller of a 6% coupon bond or mutual fund composed of this in a 7% interest rate environment, the value of those securities are going to be down because it has to match current yield. And this is where bonds and bond funds become very directional. This is math here. Not a whole else lot going on in this case here. So let's say rates go from 7, fall through 6, and down to 5%. Well, you've got your 6% coupon, and now the going rate is 5%. So if someone wants that cash flow of $60 per bond as opposed to $50 per new bond, they have to pay you a premium for that to match the current yield. So this can get a bit complicated here, but I just want you to get how the math works on this. As interest rates go higher from 6 to 7%, values go down, and when rates drop, making your coupon more valuable, the price of it goes up also. And of course, the longer you have that bond, or the more commitment there is, it can exacerbate this. So if rates are rising and you've got a 10-year bond, it's going to go down a lot more in value than if it were just coming due in 2 years. And conversely, if rates were higher and rates were falling, the longer term that bond is with that higher coupon, the better. I have colleagues that have put their kids through colleges, very expensive colleges, because they were buying treasuries back when treasuries were yielding 16 and 15%. There's 3 ways in which we classify bonds in terms of their maturity. We have short-term, which are those bonds that are typically under 5 years, intermediate term, 5 years up to 10 years, and long-term bonds, 10 years and longer. And we didn't always classify them like this. When Nixon took us off the gold standard back in, I believe, 1972, we didn't talk about short-term, intermediate, and long-term, and we didn't have that green line, which is referred to as the yield curve. We just had traders that traded 1-year paper, 3-year paper, 10-year paper, 20-year paper, and the like, and they really weren't looking to the right or the left in terms of maturities. And then Salomon Brothers kind of took this multi-trillion-dollar connect the dots game and said, what is being told to us now that we've been thrown into market chaos and market forces? What does this tell us about the economy or where this yield curve is based on what's happening at the 1 year and connecting the dots out to where yields are on the 30-year? And we have a long discussion on that, but on this one, all I want you to get intuitively is that if I am lending money out for 1 year, someone who is a lender or a creditor is not going to expect as much of a rate of return because the risk is perceived as being lower given a consistent credit quality because it's short term. Now, if we go out 30 years, it's a lot different. For example, I can borrow money, Wanda, probably for next week, and she's not going to charge me anything. Very low term. I can borrow $50 from her. If I say to Wanda, I want to borrow $10,000 for 10 years, she's going to say, wait a minute, we've got to have a promissory note. I want a rate that's adjusted upwards. It might be 8, 9, 10%. Why? Because a lot can happen to me over a 10-year period to affect my credit worthiness, plus there's time involved. So this is what's called normal, because when we lend money for longer periods of time, a lot more can happen. Therefore, we demand higher compensation where the converse applies for shorter term. All right, so with longer-term bonds, they are more affected by increases or decreases in interest rates. Why? Because you're tied in, you're locked in. Shorter-term bonds, less so. Why? Because they're coming due. And so they're very much less affected. And all I want you to do is get the intuition on this, is that the longer the commitment, the more the effect is exacerbated, either to the benefit or the negative. And the shorter term, hey, you're out in a short period of time, therefore less affected by that. All right, so we've talked about interest rate risk in the most general terms. Let's talk about credit risk. It's just the deterioration in the financial condition of the issuing corporation or government entities. This can happen overnight. We can see high-quality companies suddenly have trouble befall them, and suddenly they have their payments, either the interest payment or the repayment of principal, at risk. That's credit risk, which leads to default risk, which is just the inability of the company to make interest rate payments or repay the loan. So we'll have to start looking at credit ratings. And these are standard ratings for Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which are rating agencies on bonds. So the highest quality are AAA by both services, and then as we start getting below either BAA or BBB, we get into what are construed as lower qualities. And both Moody's and Standard & Poor's and other rating agencies calculate the probability of default or the creditworthiness and the sustainability of them able to continue to service that debt and assign these letters. And the lower the quality, the more compensation we're going to need to receive to make it a good shake. And of course, the higher quality, the less risk we perceive. Therefore, we don't have to pay out as much in terms of interest rate on these. So in this regard, government bonds, backed by the full faith and credit of, you fill in the country, lowest credit risk and historically lower returns. Why? Because of the lower credit risk. Higher quality corporate bonds, which would be the BBBs and then moving up through the A, AA, and AAA, they have higher credit risk than government bonds and higher returns. Because the full faith and credit of that government, either the ability to print money or certainly they can't default, so they will print money, has the lowest credit risk. There's nothing backing high-quality corporate bonds outside of the creditworthiness of that corporation. So there is some credit risk even in the highest quality bonds. Lower quality bonds have higher credit risk. And again, just get the intuition on this. Not as good a balance sheet. Therefore, a higher potential for the missing of a payment or a default. Let's move over to a poll question. Which is more risky? And then we'll do some an analysis on this also. All right, overwhelmingly, you've got the answer right. Now, let's work through this here. Most of you answered, 90% of you answered longer-term, lower-quality corporate bonds. And there's a couple of things going on here. They're more risky because they're longer term. And as we have learned, the longer you have that commitment and you're tied into it, a lot can happen. So it increases the risk both of interest rate risk and it increases the possibility of credit risk because even corporations go through cycles in terms of their credit worthiness. So if you own a 10 or a 20-year bond, you have more risk both from an interest rate risk standpoint as well as the lower quality of the corporate bonds, whereas short-term U.S. government bonds don't. I theoretically have no credit risk, and I have very little interest rate risk because of the short-term nature of it. That bond comes due, and then I can participate if I choose to by reinvesting it into then higher interest rates. Very good answers. All right, so stocks, their risk and return attributes, higher risk than cash and bonds, and typically higher returns than cash and bonds. Now, I want to put a caveat in here, because I'm speaking in what we call generally acceptable principles of investing, which looks at 80 years of data And from that, we arrive at the conclusion of looking at 80 or 85 years of data that cash typically has lower returns than bonds, which typically have lower returns than stocks do. But I want you to look at this just as a first cut, because as we'll learn in Part 3 and in Part 4 of this, that a lot of this comes down to context. And what historical rates of returns might be might not be your experience for your investing time frame. So we can look at this in the most general terms with regard to the risk attributes and the potential for returns in compensation for the risk, but we always have to look at this within a context, which we'll get to at future points. So this stocks, higher return historically with more volatility to them. That's how we're defining risk here. More volatility than bonds and stocks. Now, we recently went through a 30-year period where the 20-year U.S. Treasury did better over a 30-year period than stocks did. So again, these are general terms that may not apply in your particular instance, but we're just using them to forward the idea that stocks, as a rule, typically have more volatility and more risk, and as a return for that, a higher potential rate of return for the risk. Another way we measure stocks, we love to slice and dice, is based on market capitalization. And market capitalization is just simply the shares outstanding times the share price. So if I am a company that has 100 million shares outstanding and my stock price is $50, my market cap is $5 billion. So I fall pretty much right smack dab in the middle of mid-cap. Now, don't get too hung up on these numbers in here. I just want you to get how small is, very small companies, as opposed to how big can be. Now, large cap is just 10 billion and over. Some of the household names that we know, for example, AT&T, Exxon, Google, Apple, have market caps measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So just get from this slide how big can be and how small can be, and that there are inherent risks in smaller cap stocks than there are in large cap just because of the capitalization. So domestic, as a general rule, domestic large cap stocks are the lowest risk among stock categories. So we can slice that even more so to make my point. Good, high quality, good growth companies with pristine balance sheets don't carry a lot of risk to them on a relative basis relative to domestic small cap companies, which often are out there in the bond market and have a lot of bonds, and so they have leveraged up balance sheets. They're more susceptible to market forces because of their smaller size. And that goes over into foreign-based companies, which would be the next level of risk that can have return potentials every bit equal to domestic large cap or small cap, but because of other factors, they typically have a higher rate of return, yet they have more risk associated with them. So don't look at this as being, this next slide here, as being actually proportional. All I want you to get from this is from the left-hand side, the risk moving up and the return moving out, is that the lowest risk with the least return is cash. And as we move up here, we assume more risk for our willingness to take on the return potential, which is where we get up into stocks and into the small cap and foreign. So let's take another poll here. This is poll number 9, and you've been just tremendous on getting very close to the right answers on most of these. Which is less risky? Wanda, do you remember back in grade school where you knew the answer so much that your hand went up so fast you actually kind of stood up a little bit? That's what we're finding with this one. All right, so 96% of you have large cap stocks as the least risky In other words, we look at this a couple of ways. The Graham-Dodd way of risk, meaning you didn't do anything, the company went out of business, that risk, or volatility. So large cap stocks in that context between small cap and foreign are the less risky of the three. Correct answer. Let's go to another poll. Number 10, which historically has the higher return potential? All right, let's look at this. 90% of you said foreign or emerging markets, and some of you said large cap U.S. stocks. So we can quibble on that one, but it probably is foreign emerging stocks, rapidly growing regions, rapidly growing companies. And many of these companies, particularly foreign companies and countries, from a sovereign debt standpoint, they haven't figured out this debt thing yet. So they're not overly burdened, either from a sovereign standpoint, I mean the country itself, or these companies. And they have very good balance sheets, and the returns are there. So we can look at traditionally emerging markets with some of the opacity from an accounting standpoint, and certainly political or risk of geopolitical and terrorism does kind of have them to where there's a lot more risk, but boy, there sure has been the demonstration of the returns there. And then one can argue, yeah, but when you smooth all that out, and if you take a particular time frame, I'll just stay with the large cap U.S. stocks because really they have a real high return if you want to adjust that for volatility. We can quibble that. They're both good answers. What is good is that you figured out that short-term, high-quality corporate bonds do not have the higher return potential. Next one, please. So where do we list stocks, bonds, and cash? Well, they would show up on your assets, liabilities, and net worth statement in the appropriate category, either as cash showing up in your money market accounts, cash on hand savings, and then your stock funds, your 401ks would show up under your investment assets. We have another poll here. If risk is defined, and this goes to the gentleman that brought up the yeah, but how do you define risk about interest rates? Here's another way of looking at this. If risk is defined as the probability of not meeting your investment objective, and if my investment objective is to grow my money over the long term, which is riskier? Interesting. I don't think I've ever seen 100% get the right answer. But you're exactly correct. And this is where it's important. And I know those in the financial services profession get this and need to educate. And those of you who are not in the financial services profession, get this education today. We need to look at how we want to regard risk. Is risk just short-term volatility, the ups and downs of the market? Or is risk defined as me not having sufficient dollars to sustain me for what might be a 20 or 30-year period when either my income is cut out completely, I go into retirement, or dramatically reduced? So we need to look at the trade-off between what it is we're attempting to accomplish and how much market risk we are willing to assume. FDIC insured savings accounts have arguably no risk. They're insured, but they're not even keeping up with the rate of inflation. So this is where, as we'll learn, time frame comes into play here. So if we have a multiple decade period, then stocks, for most of us, or other growth assets, if what we're trying to do is grow our money, we have a better chance with growthier investments if we allow them enough time to keep our money at least whole with the rate of inflation. Asset allocation is very simply how we divvy up among the basic asset classes of stocks, bonds, and cash, or other asset allocations. And we can come up with that based on how much risk we're willing to assume, how much income we need. All of these go into the asset allocation decisions, which we will get more into in Part 2 and 3. So let's go through a review of what we've learned so far today. All right, what we've learned, I can account for my money, and I can do that through my assets, liabilities, and net worth statement. I know how money can be used. I can spend it. Let's go back to the assets, how I can account for my money. I can use my assets, liabilities, and net worth statement. Those are simple. Please use them. Know where the money goes. The cash flow statement. And I recommend that you use that cash flow statement for a 30-day period or a 60-day period so that you figure out where your money is actually going. Next one, please. I know how it can be used. I can spend it. I can use it to pay down debt. I can save it, or I can assume deliberately risk and invest the money if I have sufficient time frame. So what else I've learned is that risk is the deliberate assumption, or excuse me, investing is the deliberate assumption of risk, and I can play that risk out in various asset classes, stocks, bonds, and cash, and then how I model that mix, that percentage between stocks, bonds, and cash is determined by what I'm attempting to accomplish, how much time I have, and how much risk I'm willing to take on to accomplish that goal. Again, more on that in Part 2 and Part 3. What else have we learned? We've learned that cash is the lowest risk with the lowest return. Bonds, higher risk than cash and typically higher returns. Stocks have higher risk than both cash and bonds and typically have higher returns than cash and bonds. So, next webinar will be held, Part 2, Money, Getting to Know You, September 25th at 11:30 to 1, again, Eastern Standard Time. Part 3 is where we start setting the goals and spending plans, is October 9th, and there's a linkage to all of this. Today was just to know the flow. Next is getting to know our money and our relationship with money, and we're going to do a case study with Penny and Bill in Part 2, and we're going to do a little psychological and financial detective work with them. And where are the problems that might not be showing themselves based on ratios and how much money they make, but are lurking there? And it's for us to look at where those problems are and where we might be able to get some workouts. Then we look at matching up our money with what it is we're attempting to accomplish in Part 3. And then Part 4 is how do we manage our future now? Decisions that we are making now. Typically, with most of us, where we are right now in life is not because of the last really smart thing we did or last, well, kind of silly thing that we did or stupid thing we did. It typically is the compounding of either mostly good or mostly bad decisions compounding on themselves over a multiple decade period that has us where we are. Same thing with investing. So decisions that we make right now, though in isolation doesn't seem like a whole lot or have any real moment to it, when we compound that over a multiple decade period, it can have you either in a very good space or the decisions that you're making now could be very much life-altering. So all of these have linkage to them, culminating in Part 4. And so I appreciate having you being part of this today. I'm going to turn this over to Wanda here for just a moment.
Well, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions at this point, you're welcome to type them in the chat pod. Or, of course, if you think of questions before Part 2, we'd be happy to catch up and answer any of those questions before we move on to the September 25th Part 2 webinar. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your email. And I will go through all of that and make sure to provide everybody with that shared their emails, the handouts, as well as those who wanted the Certificate for Continuing Education units from AFCPE. I just see some folks typing, so I'm going to give them just a couple more minutes or so. Yes, there will be a link to the recording after we've completed this here. Dee at Iowa State, who's our recording host, will provide that link, and I will actually add that to the eXtension Learn system, and can also email that link out to folks when I send them an email, but it will be listed on eXtension's Learn system. Well, thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see or virtually be participating with folks on September 25th for part 2.